Ever thought what goes through a man's mind when he knows the exact minute he's going to die? And when the clock finally ticks down, do you face it with fear or resignation? This is the story of Edward James, who was one of Florida's longest-serving death row inmates and was just executed after 3 decades of isolation, appeals, and controversy. What were his final words? What was his last meal? And why did his story remain etched in Florida's legal history for so long? Let's take you inside his final 24 hours. It was 5:15 p.m. when the final denial came. The Supreme Court refused to hear Edward James' last-ditch appeal, a decision that slammed the door shut after nearly 30 years of legal maneuvering. By 5:20 p.m., the governor's office released a concise statement. The execution of Edward James will proceed as scheduled at 6 p.m. From that moment on, every second was a relentless countdown. Edward James, then 31 years old, wasn't always a household name, but the horror of his crime in 1993 and the lengthy legal battle that followed etched his name into Florida's dark criminal history. His conviction in 1995 stemmed from the brutal double murder of 8-year-old Toni Neuner and her grandmother Betty Dick, which occurred on a terrifying night in September 1993 in Castleberry, Florida. James, who had been boarding in Betty Dick's home, was found responsible for a drug-fueled rampage. Court records detail the unspeakable. He sexually assaulted and strangled young Toni, then stabbed her grandmother 21 times. 2 other younger children were asleep in the home, untouched physically, but forever scarred by the tragedy. Toni's older sister Wendy was tied up and locked in a bathroom, left to listen to the horror unfold. The raw brutality of the crime against a child and an elderly woman shocked the quiet community of Seminole County. James fled, leading authorities on a multi-state manhunt that gripped headlines across the nation. For weeks, he evaded capture, traveling in Betty Dick's stolen car. His flight ended on October 6, 1993, when he was apprehended in Bakersfield, California. It was there, miles from the unspeakable acts he committed, that Edward James provided a chillingly detailed videotaped confession to the police, recounting the horrific events of that night. This confession was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case. In April 1995, Edward James pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with charges of aggravated child abuse, attempted sexual battery, kidnapping, and grand theft. Despite his guilty plea, a jury overwhelmingly recommended the death penalty with an 11-1 vote. Judge O.H. Eaton Jr. subsequently imposed the death sentence. This marked the official start of a nearly 3-decade-long legal odyssey, a period often characterized by the agonizingly slow churn of appeals in capital punishment cases. For 29 years, Edward James resided on Florida's death row. This remarkable length of time highlights the complex and often emotionally draining appeals process that accompanies death penalty cases in the United States. From his conviction in 1995 until his execution in 2025, James and his legal team embarked on a relentless journey through state and federal courts. His appeal spanned a wide range of legal arguments, from procedural errors in his original trial to more recent contentions about his mental competency. The legal landscape surrounding capital punishment evolved significantly over these decades, and each new legal precedent offered a sliver of hope, however fleeting, for a different outcome. Spending almost 3 decades in the stark confines of death row is a profound and unique experience. It's an existence defined by confinement, routine, and the constant looming presence of the ultimate punishment. For James, the passage of time also brought a significant decline in his physical health. In January 2023, he suffered a near-fatal heart attack while incarcerated, an event that his attorneys immediately seized upon as a new basis for appeal. News reports from March 2025 detail how his lawyers argued that the resulting brain damage from oxygen deprivation during the heart attack rendered him mentally incompetent for execution. They presented compelling medical evidence arguing that carrying out the sentence against a man in such a diminished state would violate constitutional prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment. However, court after court, from the Florida Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court, systematically rejected these final, desperate appeals. In the dwindling days leading up to March 20th, 2025, all legal avenues for Edward James had been exhausted, his fate sealed. Governor Ron DeSantis signed his death warrant, confirming the date for the culmination of nearly 3 decades of waiting. As the sun began to set on March 20th, The atmosphere surrounding Florida State Prison in Rayford grew heavy with a palpable sense of finality. Media crews, legal representatives, and various advocacy groups converged outside, bearing silent witness to the last hours of a man whose life was about to end. Inside the walls, Edward James began his final day early, waking at 7 a.m. His last meal request was a specific one: fried catfish, potato salad, hush puppies, cookies, soda, and coffee. This seemingly simple request takes on an extraordinary significance in the context of an execution, representing one of the few remaining choices for a condemned man. Reports from within the prison described his quiet demeanor in his final hours. Every meticulous detail, from the preparation of his meal to his escort to the death chamber, was performed according to strict protocol. At approximately 8 p.m. EST, Edward James was led into the execution chamber. Witnesses, including members of the victims' families, media representatives, and prison officials, were present, separated by a thick glass pane. The room was deliberately kept cold, a sterile environment, for the final act of the state. At 8:07 p.m., the warden formally asked James if he had any last words. According to official reports from the Florida Department of Corrections, Edward James's response was concise. He stated simply, "No, I don't." He briefly raised his head, appearing to look towards the witnesses in the viewing room, before the lethal injection drugs began to flow into his veins. Edward James is killed by lethal injection for murders of Betty Dick and her granddaughter, Toni Neuner, in 1993. The cocktail, designed to sedate, paralyze, and ultimately stop the heart, took its swift effect. Witnesses observed his chest trembling and arms making brief, involuntary movements before he became still. The conclusion of Edward James's decades-long journey on death row brought a complex mix of emotions for the families of Betty Dick and Toni Neuner. Jared Pearson, Toni's brother, spoke to reporters afterwards, expressing that the family found some kind of peace with the execution, but he also articulated the enduring pain. "We lost generations because of him. It's all pure evil." His words, echoing the deep wounds left by such a heinous crime, resonate across all capital cases, highlighting the often unresolvable grief that persists long after a verdict or an execution. Edward James's execution isn't just the end of a long and painful chapter. It's a haunting reminder of the weight of justice, the depth of human tragedy, and the irreversible consequences of violent crime. It forces us to confront difficult questions about morality, punishment, and the legacy of pain left behind. Do you believe the death penalty brings closure, or does it raise even more questions? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And if you value deep, honest explorations of true crime and the justice system, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching.